so now let's get started on chapter 3. Chapter 3 is all about tissues. This is also called histology. This is a pretty dense chapter. It's going to be a very visual one. So keep in mind you'll need to not just know the basic kind of written textbook parts of this, but you'll also need to be able to identify tissues from sight. So keep that in mind as you go through this chapter. It's a pretty dense one, so take your time with it as much as you can. Really put in some time and effort with this chapter. It really is just a practicing type chapter for this class. So let's go ahead and get into the introduction, the things that we're going to cover for this chapter. We're going to talk about the main tissue types. So we got 4 tissue types that we're going to talk about. And then we're going to talk about their roles and what they do within the body that makes them functional. We're going to talk about each of the categories individually as well. So we'll talk about epithelial tissues and what they do and some of the smaller groupings within the epithelial tissues. We'll talk about different connective tissues, and then we'll also go into muscle and nervous tissues as well. And so again, we'll get a little bit detailed in what they look like, how they're structured, and then what they do. So let's get into our types of tissues. So we're going to be identifying the 4 main tissue types, talk about the main functions that each category does, the structure of each main category, and then where do they originate from when we're looking at an embryo, and the 3 major germ layers and tissue membranes. So first and foremost, before we even talk about 4 different types of tissues, we have to define what a tissue even is, right? So a tissue is just a group of cells that are found together in the body, and they look the same, they have the same embryonic origin. So when we say share morphological features, we mean they look the same, right? They act the same, and they're arranged in a specific pattern to achieve a certain function. So the cells within a tissue basically are like all copies of each other, right? They're all the same basically cell over and over and over again, grouped together to do a specific job. And we have 4 big categories of tissues, and we'll break each of these categories down into smaller pieces, but let's talk about the 4 major categories first, which would be epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous tissue. And we're going to talk about these in this order for the rest of the videos in this chapter. So let's take a peek. So the 4 major tissue types, we have nervous tissue. These are going to be tissues that make up things like your spinal cord, your nerves, and your brain. Epithelial tissues, we like to think of these as linings, so the inner or outer linings of things, so like the inside lining of your digestive system organs, as well as things like the surface of your skin, the inner lining of your mouth, the inner lining of the vagina. Those would all use epithelial tissue. Muscle tissue, we have 3 types, cardiac, smooth, and skeletal, all for movement, right? All of them, regardless of which type we're looking at, are involved in moving parts of the body or moving something within the body. And then connective tissue at the very, very end, we think things like support, as well as, connecting one part of the body to another. That's kind of why we have that. So things like bone, tendon, ligaments, fat, other types of padding and soft tissues are included in connective tissues. And really, we'll start with the heavier 2, epithelial and connective are kind of the biggest categories that are very, very diverse. And then nervous tissue and muscle tissue are not less important, but they don't have as many details that you'll need to know for this class at least. They're not as big and as varied categories as connective and epithelial are. So if you're trying to figure out how to study and how much time you need to put into these things, epithelial and connective will probably take you a little longer simply because they're very big and diverse categories in and of themselves. So let's talk about where these tissues come from. We mentioned stem cells in the last chapter, and we talked about like the multipotent stem cells and the pluripotent stem cells, and that pluripotent could become any part of the body, right? Which means pluripotent stem cells could become any of the 3 germ layers, ecto, meso, or endoderm. But when we talked about the multipotent ones, remember they got a little bit more narrow. And so you saw that some of those multipotent ones could only become parts of the ectoderm, some could only become parts of the mesoderm, and some could only become parts of the endoderm. Well, what do these terms even mean? These are just germ layers. So like this is going to be one of kind of the first ways that the developing embryo is going to start to differentiate, that the cells are going to start becoming different from each other. So the first thing, before we get to like all the fancy detail that our bodies have, we go from all generic cells to these three special lines of cells: ecto, meso, and endoderm cells. If you are an ectoderm cell, then you are limited to becoming only the things that are in this box here. So things like the epidermis, glands on the skin, some of the bones found in the cranium, the pituitary, the adrenal medulla, the nervous system, and then the inner lining of like the anus and the mouth and whatnot. So you're limited, if you're an ectoderm cell, to just becoming one of these types of cells. If you're a mesoderm cell, you become kind of what I would call the guts, right? The meats and potatoes of the human body. So the connective tissues, bone, cartilage, blood, the inner lining of blood vessels, muscle, the joints, right? The membranes in the body cavities, the kidneys, the lining of the gonads. So, I mean, this is kind of when you're thinking like the inner, your guts, right, is the mesoderm. And then the endoderm is the very inner lining, so the inside lining of your lungs, the inside lining of your digestive system, the glands, so endocrine glands, the adrenal cortex, the digestive glands, these are all coming from the endoderm. And that these tissues are not just on their own, we form membranes with these. So these tissue membranes, again, it's just like a thin layer, or like a sheet, kind of like how a sheet of paper would be wide and thin. Same thing with the tissue membrane that covers something, right? So the outside of the body, like your skin, or the coverings of your organs, like the pericardium. The internal passageways that lead to the outside of the body, so like your digestive tract from your mouth all the way down, and then the lining of movable joint cavities. And we have really two basic types. We have the epithelial and the connective tissue membranes. So let's talk about epithelial membranes first. These guys, this is the connective tissue that the epithelium is going to attach to. We have three different types of epithelial membranes. We have the mucous membrane. This is going to line your body cavities that go to the outside environment. So you think about like in your nose, in your mouth, right? Things like that, your mucous membranes. We then have the serous membranes. These are lining cavities that don't open to the outside. So like the covering around your heart, the pericardium, the covering the membrane around your lungs, the pleura, right? And then the cutaneous membrane, this is going to be your skin. The connective tissue membranes are formed from connective tissue, hence the name, and these are going to encapsulate like your organs, like your kidneys, or they're going to be part of your movable joints. So like there's a synovial membrane that lines the cavity inside of a freely movable joint. And we have a whole chapter on joints, so don't get too caught up in the details there just yet. So where can we find these? So our mucous membranes, again, we're looking at the digestive system, your respiratory system, the urinary system, the reproductive tracts, all the components, all the parts of your body that have a potential to have contact with the outside world, right, to some degree, or opening up to the outside world. So like your digestive system, even if we go deep in to your digestive system, there's still, if you follow it far enough, you will find an opening to the outside world, right, whether you go up or down. Serous membranes are going to line things close to the exterior of the body. They're going to line body cavities that don't exit, that don't have an opening to the outside world. So like the lining around the outside of your lungs does not open up to the outside world because only the inside of the lungs does. So a serous membrane would be found on the outside of the lungs. The cutaneous membrane is just the skin, and then the synovial membranes, and these are going to be found in the joints where we have movement, so that we have that fluid being produced so that we can lubricate movable joints.